Any quick takeaways, because you've got a fantastic guest coming up here? Quick
Yeah, no,
takeaways.
I mean, Senator Warner is exactly right. I really like, as I said, the NTSB idea. I think that's got so.
Yeah, I think so too. All right. Well, you very well know our next guest, Glen Gerstell, who's former general counsel of the National Security Agency. I've known Glen for a number of years, not as well as you do because you've worked with him. But the one thing I love about Glen is he's not afraid to say what he thinks, and he thinks some really creative and really fantastic stuff. So, you know, we've talked a little bit about sort of how do you fix cyber over the last day. We've talked a little bit about, you know, how do we get the authorities, we being the United States, to do a better job of sharing information and understanding what's out there. And I cannot wait to welcome Glen and sit back and listen to the conversation between the two of you on these issues.
Thanks.
I think there he is. I'm going to go ahead and butt out, gentlemen, and I am here listening and taking notes. Thank you. Hi, Glen.
It's a pleasure to welcome Glen Gerstell, former general counsel at NSA, and as you can see by the map behind him, he is an inveterate map collector. He actually has quite the collection of antique and valuable maps, which, if you ever get him in a room, get him to talk about it, and you'll enjoy the heck out of yourself. Glen, welcome.
Thank you. Actually, can we just really talk about maps? That's a lot more interesting, all the cyber stuff.
Sure. although maybe not, because then we'll have to deal with Suzanne. So perhaps not. Glen, so you are an advisor to CSIS in your post government life, and doing some other things. But I wanted to focus on some ideas that you'd floated in a piece that you published a few weeks ago. You know, we just heard from Senator Warner and others about what we need to do to address the cyber threat. What's your overall takeaway from what we've heard?
Thanks, Rick, and also Suzanne, thank you. And it's just terrific to be part of such an incredible lineup here, addressing what in fact is more important than antique maps, which is the cyber threats we face today. So thank you. You know, as I was struck, Rick, as I listened to Senator Warner and Brad Smith before him and the other really illustrious speakers, about the fact that we really have a terrific number of great ideas on how to address this problem. But we obviously haven't fixed the problem, and that's because if it was an easy problem, we would have fixed it already. It's a complex problem requiring multiple solutions, and we've heard a lot of solutions. One thing that struck me is we've heard lots and lots of solutions, so there's no one magic miracle drug here. There's no one silver bullet, so to speak. It is a complex problem, and the other thing that struck me about it is all the ideas that were presented were ones that are within our grasp. This is not a question of figuring out the mysteries of quantum physics where we don't really fully understand all the details. This is a technology where we have the know-how in our hands today to address this problem. We haven't addressed the problem for a number of reasons, but this is something that is doable, and I'm confident we will be able to, in years to come, it'll take a while, surmount the problem.
So if all that's true, then why haven't we solved it? What's holding us back?
Well, great question. You know, I was thinking about that in anticipation of our chat today, and I was looking a little bit and doing a little bit of research on some of the other technologies that have preceded cyber, and there was some talk just now of the National Transportation Safety Board. Well, you know, the NTSB wasn't founded until after we had had aviation for many decades, until a 1934 crash involving Knute Rockne, the football coach. That was on front pages across the nation for days and led Congress to enact what now became the NTSB. It's the same with other technologies. For many, many years, railroads, because it was more efficient and cheaper, ran one line, and they ran trains in opposing directions on those, scary to think of, until the so-called Great Train Crash of 1856, in which everyone said, oh, this is an outrage, we need double tracks. An obvious point. Pick another one, electricity. We had lots of electrical fires until the 1906 Iroquois theater fire, in which 600 men and women were killed tragically. Front page news every day. And again, that led to the founding of the Underwriters Laboratory. We could go through every one of these other technologies. Cyber is only at most a generation old. The iPhone, YouTube, Facebook are all under 20 years old. We sometimes forget that because they're so ubiquitous in our lives and seem so natural. They just seem like they've been with us forever, but they haven't. So cyber is no different. We have a history of regulating technology retroactively and inadequately, in part because we generally want the free market to try to solve problems first. We, as I said, typically await a crisis or a disaster. We fear crimping or cutting off innovation in a new technology. There's some public fascination and marvel with the technology, so we don't want to tinker with it, so to speak. And there's industry opposition in all of them, whether it was electricity or aviation or whatever. There's always someone who doesn't want to be regulated, understandably enough. So the consequence is that we typically undershoot in regulation. We do it retroactively. There's a lot of trial and error, and it's an iterative process, and that's exactly what we've seen in cyber. Just very quickly, when cybersecurity which wasn't even a term, meant getting emails from Nigerian princes asking for money, that wasn't a big deal. But of course, the crisis snowballed to the point where in 2015, Congress enacted a statute, the cybersecurity statute, had to amend it just a few years later. And here we are after SolarWinds and apparent Chinese hack, looking at a very, very dramatic upscale in our regulatory approach.
So Glenn, you're actually making an argument that I made yesterday, which is we're not going to take this seriously until something really bad happens. Do you think that SolarWinds was the really bad thing, or is it something worse in our future?
Well, I mean, there's no question that SolarWinds is a tipping point, coupled with the subsequent Chinese hafnium, apparently Chinese hafnium attack. It was fascinating. We just had Senator Warner a few minutes ago talking about the fact that at his hearing of the Senate Intelligence Committee and also the House Intelligence Committee and the Homeland Security Committees, you had for the first time senators and congressmen specifically acknowledging that we had serious legal gaps across the board in everything from cyber reporting to levels of immunity to additional authorities that might be needed to address gaps, which we can talk about later. So for the first time, you actually had congressmen and women saying we have legal authorities that Congress needs to address. And so in that sense, I think it's a tipping point. I'm not going to get into the question because other speakers have addressed it about exactly the nature of the SolarWinds hack, whether it was espionage or not. We could debate that. But for our purposes, it clearly is a tipping point that will be, sadly, one of the disasters that will cause us to have a solution here.
So what are your solutions, Glenn? What would you do?
Well, of course, it's easy to say that if we started with a blank sheet of paper, we wouldn't come up with the solutions we have now, and that's easy to say. What's more difficult is recognizing what we currently have and trying to address the gaps and deficiencies that exist now. I think we need three things in ascending order of significance, and maybe even before mentioning that, there's a wide range of issues. We've heard everything from international norms and treaties to you name it. But I think if we could do three things, which are all within our grasp, would require relatively minimal legislative action, although clearly some action. In ascending order, I think one, we do need some kind of mandatory cybersecurity standards, whether that's an industry self-regulation or government or what, we could debate. But clearly we need some kind of greater uniformity in that area and some sense that it's mandatory or obligatory. We probably also need some kind of cyber breach reporting. We could couple that with immunity, maybe not, some limited, et cetera. Maybe it's limited to first responders as opposed to all companies, et cetera. We could debate the contours of it, but at some level we need some kind of mandatory cybersecurity standards and reporting. And I know you've commented on the need for software standards, for example, and that's another part of this solution. So I think that's one that's very doable, and I think within the next year or two, we will see Congress take action in that regard. The next one up a little more complicated, but again, we've seen Congress talking about too. Senator Warner was just addressing this, as was Brad Smith, which is somehow having one-stop shopping. We need a way to get all that information from the private sector, which after all is the target for all these cyber attacks, whether they're from cyber criminals or nation states or teenage hackers, what have you. We need to have a way of getting that information into the hands of the government, which can share information from the agency you and I used to work at, the National Security Agency, the Department of Homeland Security, and merge that information in a very quick way, real time, not weeks later, along with the FBI and other agencies, and get that information right back out to the private sector in a way that it can be actionable. And that means, to use the buzzword these days, in machine time, to have the ability to stop attacks as they occur before they get more widespread. That won't stop so-called zero-day exploits. I get that, but it will make a big dent in the scope of attack. So I think that's one absolutely critical thing we need to do. Maybe we would do that in some kind of fusion center, or maybe it's housed within CISA. I'm not quite sure where we do that. I think there's some advantages to having a fusion center, which, by the way, could be virtual. We could talk a little bit about that too. And then the third thing, and this is what I'd like to spend most of our time on if we can, is I think we need to recognize, as was hinted at and discussed at these congressional hearings, that we actually have a gap in authorities. Our former agency was able to look at, if it was successful, foreign malicious cyber activity, and we were able to track it as it originated from just hypothetically Russia to maybe a cutout server somewhere in Europe. We're connecting with one in the United States. And once we saw that the traffic was coming into the United States for perfectly appropriate and good reasons, which I'm not necessarily suggesting we change, that was the end of the NSA's responsibility. It was then a domestic matter that had to be turned over either to the FBI for criminal purposes or to CISA for to address civilly with the private sector. But that meant there was a gap. The FBI can't possibly get a search warrant quickly enough to go track that foreign cyber activity. And Russia, China, Iran, they know about this gap and they exploit it. So it looks like the SolarWinds attack was mounted using a virtual server rented completely legally from GoDaddy web service. Totally appropriate. They know they're using US infrastructure that we do not have the ability to continuously see. So if we're going to solve this problem, I think we need to realistically recognize that we're going to need to have some kind of authority to look at domestic malicious cyber activity that is foreign generated. I think there's a way to do this that is consistent with our civil liberties, with our government structures, and the Fourth Amendment. But at the end of the day, I think we're going to have to do that. I can't imagine that we're going to be sitting here at the Cyber Brief conference of 2031, in which, by the way, you and I will appear in hologram form, without these three steps having been taken.
So we've heard people talk about the first two steps. Talk about the third one. How would we do that? How would that work, and how can we do it legally?
So we've got some mechanical problems and some legal problems. I want to spend more time on the legal ones, partly because I'm a lawyer, but also more because those are really the true obstacles. The mechanical ones, I think we can surmount. We can figure out in government whether this cyber monitoring authority is housed within a new agency, or is shared in a fusion center, or is some purely civil industry self-regulating entity. We could address that. I think the more complicated one, because it addresses our political concerns and the Fourth Amendment, is how can we do this in a way that squares with our values and our Constitution? And of course, the minute someone starts talking about this, we hear the cry of warrantless surveillance, as if that was something that would end the debate. I want to be clear. I am not in any way suggesting that we diminish or curtail the robust protections the Fourth Amendment gives us. But I do think it's equally important and intellectually honest to recognize that warrantless surveillance, the ability of the government under appropriate circumstances, limited circumstances, to undertake surveillance for at least foreign intelligence purposes and law enforcement purposes, can in many cases and is done without a warrant. There are limited circumstances. So the Fourth Amendment is not an absolute bar to this, nor should it be. There's a legal scholar who would test the debates in this area and figure out how we can do it. Let me just briefly talk about some of the factors that go into this, and then how I might, if I could, craft such a solution to address that. So, for the first many decades of the telephone, having the FBI or the local police eavesdrop on your phone calls was not deemed a search or seizure under the Fourth Amendment. You didn't need to get a search warrant for it. It wasn't until 1967 until the Supreme Court said you need a search warrant for that. So it shows evolving standards in this area. I think that is an absolutely correct decision. You do need a search warrant for targeted electronic surveillance in the United States. But the cases look at the overall reasonableness of the nature of surveillance. What's the purpose of it? How critical is it? Are we balancing the need versus the scope and extent of the surveillance? How long does it last? How many people who aren't targets are scooped up in the surveillance, et cetera? So it looks at the totality of circumstances, what kind of safeguards, oversight there is, et cetera. If we look at the Supreme Court cases and federal court cases that outline what's permissible and where it's okay for us to have appropriate levels of surveillance without a search warrant, because that's how we can catch criminals more quickly or stop foreign terrorists, versus the smaller subset of circumstances in which we need a warrant, totally appropriate, I think we can figure out ways to do this. And here's how I would do it. I would have this new, call it cyber monitoring authority. It's not really surveillance. We're not just generally doing surveillance of all computers in the United States, far from it. I think we need to have a monitoring authority that is limited to tracking malicious foreign cyber activity when it moves onshore. So if we see specifically that there's a computer in Iran, North Korea, that is communicating with an IP address look at that particular IP address. We're not going to scoop up innocent parties in it. Maybe it requires some senior level approval of an official to do this. Maybe there's some series of internal approvals, the way at our old agency, the National Security Agency, we had a cascading series of internal requirements and external audits and checks. We could, most importantly, limit this to a duration. Perhaps this kind of monitoring or tracking or verification of a domestic computer would be for only 72 hours. Maybe we even have a provision that requires the Department of Justice or the FISA court to be notified afterwards within 24 hours of this type of monitoring, the same way our agency used to do that in the case of an emergency FISA monitoring to, say, track a foreign terrorist before they set off a bomb blowing up something. So we could emulate that. We could also perhaps involve robust oversight, perhaps the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, which has been lauded for its oversight in the foreign intelligence counterterrorism area. Perhaps we could use that board or something similar to it to look over this new authority, report on it perhaps every 6 months to say whether it's being properly used or abused. Certainly the private sector would play a role in evaluating this. And most importantly, the data that's collected from this would not be kept for years. It would have to be purged after some period of time. I don't know whether that's 60 days or 30 days or whatever it is, but at some point it would no longer be relevant. And most importantly, that data should not be used for anything other than the original purpose, namely the collection of data to see whether some computer in the United States has been taken over by the Russians or Chinese or North Koreans or Iranians and is being used as a command and control server to infect other computers. That's what we're doing this for. And so that's why the data is collected. It shouldn't be trolled through for evidence of a crime, for other surveillance purposes. I think if you put a package of safeguards like that together around this authority, we could have an authority that is robust enough to be effective, work quickly, and yet at the same time be fully consistent with our Fourth Amendment and civil liberties values.
So it's sort of a hot pursuit approach, but time limited, use limited, and lots of oversight.
Yes, I think if you do that, and again, going back to my earlier point, Rick, about trial and error, let's try this. Let's have a 2-year sunset on such legislation. Let's take a look at it. And if it turns out after a year or two that it either hasn't been effective because it isn't robust and quick enough, or it turns out it's led to trapping unwitting people in some kind of monitoring or inappropriate surveillance, it's hard to believe there'd be deliberate abuses, but okay, anything's possible. And if it turns out it's not working or it's inappropriate, let's fix it. But we've got to try something. It can't possibly be the case that we just have to sit here and say the Fourth Amendment creates such a problem and such an obstacle and is so politically fraught that we just have to sit here and let the Chinese romp through our, or Russians or whoever, romp through our computer infrastructure. That can't possibly be the right answer for our democracy.
Yeah, yeah, that's a really intriguing idea. It appeals to me. I can also see the. I'll put on my my EFF hat and see, little spikes are going off, saying, this is bad, this is bad, this is bad. How do you address that concern? How do you address the concern that well, wait, I'm already at a place where I think what you're allowed to do now is bad, and now you're asking for authority to do more?
Well, I draw a distinction between what we already do in some other areas versus this new authority that I'm suggesting. This is not a general surveillance authority. I'm not seeking that. I don't think that's what's appropriate here. So put aside, I would tell the EFF and the ACLUs and others whose comments in this area are valuable. I'm not in any way dismissing their concerns. They are a legitimate part of the debate. But I would say put aside the issue of generalized surveillance for foreign intelligence purposes and counterterrorism purposes. That's important. We can have that debate and decide where exactly we want to move the lever on a scale of what's appropriate or not. But in this case, I would go back and say to privacy advocates who are concerned about this, number one, we can fashion a package that addresses every single one of the points that have been raised in perhaps a dozen federal court cases that have touched the question of electronic surveillance. We can address all these in a way fully consistent with the law, fully consistent with the Fourth Amendment. Some of the steps I outlined, and those are hardly unique or exclusive. I'm sure many others will have many other good ideas, but we could put together a package that will address the legal concerns. And I would go back and say, what's the alternative? Is the alternative to simply say that we are not going to have any ability to look at what happens when the Chinese or the Russians or the North Koreans lease a server in the United States and use it for malicious purposes to stop hospitals from operating because they impose ransomware and, God forbid, patients die on an operating table just because we can't touch a computer located in Indianapolis. That to me makes no sense at all. I can't imagine it makes any sense to even a privacy or civil liberties strong advocate. There is a solution here. We need to figure out a solution, and there is one.
I like it, Glenn. I'm on board. Sign me up.
Okay.
Suzanne, are you there?
I'm always here. And I heard a little dig off the top that I might get mad at you. You guys can hear me, right?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's so many of these ideas that we've been talking about, you've consistently and very successfully woven through the conversation over the last 30 minutes or so. I wonder, Glenn, if there was sort of one change that you could just magically make, overnight, that you feel like would go the furthest in terms of, allowing the U.S. to be able to have better visibility on some of the threat actors who do sometimes operate within the U.S. And then also benefit the private sector. What would be the one thing where you'd start that you'd say, if we could just get this done, we could make progress on everything else as we go? Or is there one thing? It might not be that easy.
Well, it's a totally appropriate. I'm hesitant to single out any one thing, but if we could work our way to any one thing, it would probably be this notion, which other speakers have reiterated, starting with Dimitri early this morning, right up to Senator Warner just minutes ago, of the need to combine in some actionable way information that the private sector has with the public sector, with the private sector together with the public sector, and do so in a way that enables two-way sharing of information in real time, so that artificial intelligence can act upon it and stop attacks as they start to occur. If we could get to some system that will allow us to do that, I was using the term one-stop shopping before, whether it's housed in a government agency, whether it's housed in a virtual fusion center or some industry self-regulatory body, we could debate what's the right approach. But if we could get to that place where we had one-stop shopping with effective real-time information sharing, that has to make a huge difference by definition.
Rick, we keep hearing the same thing come up over and over again. I mean, we're clearly going to have to kind of focus and push into this area. I have a question for you, Glenn, from one of our hundreds of listeners. Thank you guys all so much for joining us and being a part of the conversation with us over these 3 days. He says, it sounds like the proposed monitoring authorities would rely heavily on the NSA's compliance program. Is NSA compliance currently able to handle development of safeguards for such a system, or will new and unique compliance programs be necessary?
Sure. You know, when I was a lawyer in private practice, I used to complain about government regulation and levels of oversight of my private sector clients. And when I switched to working at the NSA, I realized, gosh, the NSA is the most regulated entity in the United States government, overseen by everything from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the Department of Justice, to the federal court system, and a unique court, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, the Department of Defense, dozens of layers of congressional committees, inspector generals, et cetera. All totally appropriate. Don't get me wrong, I am not complaining. But the NSA has a very successful record of effective oversight and internal compliance programs. What I'm suggesting in my proposal is not necessarily expanding the NSA's authority itself. That's certainly a solution. My personal guess is that's probably tough right now, given the political realities, and maybe that authority is better housed somewhere else, just as a matter of political expediency. But the NSA's role in this would be to do what it does best and what it does now in a completely lawful way, which is to supply the foreign intelligence piece of this to this fusion center, I'll call it. And that doesn't require any change in NSA's compliance program. It would be up to this new entity, and we could decide who it's going to be, to take this authority, use the information it got from the NSA or the CIA or whoever, and then go find that, to use my proverbial computer server located in Indianapolis that's causing the problem, or not, and verify that it isn't a problem.
Glenn, if we were going to actually kind of like map out what next steps would be to get a little bit closer to figuring out whether your suggestion and your approach is viable, who would be the right people to have at that table to say, okay, let's take a thorough examination of whether this might work. We need these 4 or 5 people on board with this to move it forward. And I realize it's a very sort of technical, practical-ish question, but it's something that I think, you know, a lot of us think about when we see Washington come up with great ideas and then they just get sucked into the great idea vacuum, and very little gets moved forward, at least at the speed at which adversaries are acting right now. So who would be sort of the stakeholders, maybe that's a better way to say it, in moving this idea a little forward?
I'm tempted to echo Senator Warner's comment that if you could just get all the speakers at your Cipher Brief conference in a room, maybe we could figure it out. And there's certainly definitely some truth to that. But more importantly and more seriously, I think what we need to do, and I'm trying to be part of that process in my own small, tiny way, is have some people come up with some ideas, throw them out for public discourse, and have others beat up on them and make suggestions and improve them and critique them. So this is the start of the process. I think ultimately we would have a situation where congressional staff committees reach out to both the private sector who would be affected, as well as civil libertarian groups. Rick just mentioned the EFF, Electronic Frontier Foundation, the ACLU, other privacy groups. I would involve them in a dialogue with congressional staff members, produce a sample bill, and have public hearings held on that, have a robust dialogue with the private sector, which absolutely must be part of this. This is not going to work if it's just government dictating a solution. And I think progress can be made in that way, in a way that people would feel comfortable about it. And as again, I mentioned, it's a trial and error process. We'll come back to it after a period of time and reevaluate it. I think that's totally appropriate.
I think that makes a lot of sense.
Glenn, I think there's an opportunity for you to exercise your cartographical skills by crafting a map of what this will
Mapping it out.
Okay,
Oh
I'm ready. Sign me up.
If only it were that easy. I think there's a lot to move forward with here, though, gentlemen, from this conversation. And Rick, you've been a supporter of the Cyber Initiatives Group initiative that we worked to launch before COVID hit, which unfortunately got a little impacted by COVID, like all the rest of us in the world. It might be worth kind of setting up a venue where you can have almost like a peer review, like they do in the medical community. Opportunity, Glenn, that you kind of laid out here. I think that's a great idea, and you've given me some homework to go away and think about whether we might be able to actually pull something out of a conference that moves this conversation in a very positive way for national security and for security for a lot of the private sector businesses that are on the call with us today. So I appreciate that idea. Rick, any closing thoughts for Glenn before we go? Do you guys both veterans of the same community? Any closing thoughts?
I would just say that to thank Glenn for his willingness to engage on this and his provocative ideas. I like it. And Glenn, you were a great general counsel. You passed the first test, which was keep me out of jail. So thumbs up.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure working with you, and it's been a pleasure joining the Cipher Brief conference. And I look forward to hearing the remaining day and a half. So thank you all.
Thank you. We should definitely have you here, Glenn, tomorrow when we run our exercise, just so you can help us debrief from a legal perspective. Okay. Thank you so much. And I really appreciate both of you being Cipher Brief experts, where we continue to kind of bring you this great thought and move it forward. Glenn, thanks for being a part of that with us as well.
Thank you.